Hello, everyone, and welcome to this year's SSPI-WISE International Women's Day panel. For those of you in the room and joining us online that I haven't met yet, I'm Catherine Gazinski, Chairwoman of SSPI. We are thrilled to see the progress in representation and engagement with more of SSPI's membership through the Women in Space engagement, and we're committed to advancing that cause. Today's session is one of many opportunities to connect and learn put on by WISE and SSPI in cities throughout the world all year long. If you're not a member yet, please join us. You can go to SSPI.org or reach out to Tamara Bond-Williams, our Director of Engagement. Before we begin, I want to say a huge thank you to WISE champion, Hogan Lovells, for hosting today's event. Support from ally organizations like Hogan Lovells is crucial to WISE's progress. Moving on to our session, I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's panel with these outstanding leaders shaping the future of regulatory affairs in our space. Ruth Pritchard Kelly is an expert on satellite regulatory policy with over 30 years of experience. She is currently the Senior Advisor for Regulatory and Space Policy at OneWeb, where she advises a global team of legal and technical policy analysts. Pritchard Kelly has also worked at O3B, now SES Networks, and American Mobile Satellite Corporation. She has a master's degree in space and telecommunications policy from George Washington University and a JD from the University of Maryland. Ms. Pritchard Kelly is on the board of the U.S. Telecommunications Training Institute and is a member of the advisory committee for the Secure World Foundation. With that, Ruth, I'll give it to you.
Hello, and welcome to the SSPI's special panel in honor of International Women's Day 2023. I'm Ruth Pritchard Kelly, the moderator of today's panel. The SSPI is the International Association for Space and Satellite Professionals, and most recently has established the mentoring group called Women in Space Engagement, or WISE. Today's panel brings the three most important leaders in the satellite world together for the first time ever, and they just happen to be women. Today we have Doreen Bogdan-Martin, the Secretary General of the International Telecommunication Union, Jessica Rosenworcel, the Chairwoman of the Federal Communications Commission, and Diane Howard, the Director of Commercial Space Policy for the U.S. National Space Council. We've asked them to tell us a bit about how they got into the field.
So coming to me and how I started as an intern at the Commerce Department, NTIA. I started doing someone's filing system who was in charge of the European Commission. And at the time, it was the Directive on Television Without Frontiers. And in trying to make her a filing system that was all paper, I had to read all of the different pieces of paper, and I became an expert in Television Without Frontiers. But one of my first big assignments after I became a real staffer at NTIA was on satellite communications. And of course, back then, it was Intelsat, Inmarsat, and Rene Anselmo from Pan Am Sat. And some of you may remember his spot in the Truth and Technologies Will Triumph. I won't say the rest, but it was the time when new players were coming on the market, and there was a big push to have further liberalization of the separate satellite systems policy. So I was actually part of the team at NTIA that rewrote the separate satellite systems policy. It was lots of fun way back then. A couple years after I started at NTIA, I was sent to the ITU for 3 months, and it was extended by 3 months, and then it was extended by 3 months. And 28 years later, here I am. But what's incredible is that we work in such a dynamic sector, and being at the ITU, serving in different functions, it never gets boring.
That's amazing. And Diane, just before I turn to you, I just want, it reminded me of how I got into this. I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you. I was an intern, effectively, literally a file clerk at a small engineering company. Yes, it happened to be my father's company, but that happens to a lot of us. I thought I was going to be an actress. You make no money. So my father graciously gave me a day job back in the days when you literally had to open mail and date stamp it and put it in someone's physical inbox. And he was a satellite engineer, and there was a huge international fight. The Germans put up a German language satellite television satellite, and the French were horrified. And the French demanded that the Germans cease communicating into France in the German language. And either the ITU or Germany hired my father to basically say that's not how satellite footprints work. It shines on you from outer space. However, you, France, as a sovereign nation, may refuse to let your people receive the signal. If you like, that is your complete right. If you want to be one of those countries that doesn't permit its people to receive information from other countries. And the French realized how that sounded. And my father was a very black and white engineer. He was not at all a delicate or tactful, policy-oriented diplomat, but it was very effective. And I thought, oh, what is that? What are you doing? And he said, well, it's spectrum policy. That's what the ITU does. And I thought, oh, forget acting. And first I got my degree at George Washington, which is it's now a Space Policy Institute. And then while working with some lawyers, one of whom is in this room, thank you, Lon Levin, I realized I could have been a lawyer, and I went back to school. So I went back to school twice at night, well into my 30s, and I don't regret a minute of it. I have enjoyed that experience, the serendipity, and the just sort of turn in the direction that seems appealing, and don't worry that you've missed the one true way forward. Diane, tell us about your journey.
Well, thank you very much. Happy International Women's Day to everybody. I'm not wearing a blue suit, but I am wearing blue hair. So I'm in it to win it. So that's a lot to follow. So I'm going to tell you that I have a story of serendipity, and green lights is what I like to call them as well. And I am not a telecommunications person. I'm, in space all the way. Space is the place. Always loved space. But I too, I went to university to be an actress and came to New York City. That didn't happen. And through the course of many life decisions, I ended up in the fashion industry. Loved it. It was successful. It was exciting, but it was boring. After a certain point, I realized, wow, I'm, making a lot of money for people, and, this is fun. And I have a design room that'll make anything I want. But at the end of the day, what am I doing to be a part of the solution? Not, just another person who's, racking up zeros in your checking account. And so I decided to go back to school, and I decided that I was going to find a purpose, some sort of greater good, and serve that purpose. And I thought the environment was going to be it. And here's my serendipity story. So I was waiting for parts for my car, and a man next to me said, "Oh, so what do you do for a living?" I said, "I'm getting ready to start law school." "Oh, what kind of law do you want to practice?" I said, I want to serve the greater good. I'm going to be an environmental lawyer." He said, "You should look up. You really should think about space law." Now, this is like the late 90s, and we're really starting to garbage that up. And I said, "Space like Star Trek?" And he said, "Yeah." And I was like, okay. So when I got to orientation at the law school, they show you the library. They said, "What would you like to look up?" I said, "I want to look up space law." And they found me the Outer Space Treaty, and I was called. So that would be the first thing that I would tell you about how I got here, is knowing when I was ready to grow and showing up and being responsive to the environment, because there are, little signals that the universe is giving you, but you got to be paying attention. And then take the risk, show up, do it. Whatever it is. When I was teaching, I used to tell my students, whatever it is, show up, be there and show up all the way. Do the filing, be the intern, whatever it takes. The long and the short of it is, I was an academic for a number of years, and I got to a certain point where, I'd helped put together a pretty like a spearheading interdisciplinary program that was sort of giving points of entry for young people that wanted to be in the space field, but they didn't want to be engineers. So it had two tracks. It had a policy and law track, management, and it had a technical track. It didn't require that you be an engineer, but some math and physics. And it was wonderful. I mean, I worked at Embry-Riddle. They gave me the latitude to write 5 full courses, which is amazing. And I had the opportunity not just to have mentors, but to be a mentor. And one day, again, I woke up and I said, wow, you know what? I've already set these courses up. I don't need to keep doing this. I should find another woman that can be my successor, because it's a great space law teaching job I've set up here. And I could see some of the things that were going on in DC at that point. And I said, I want a bigger life. And I said it out loud at a National Space Council meeting back at Kennedy Space Center in 2018. And I met somebody who became a mentor to me, and that was Kevin O'Connell. We had this incredible meeting of the minds conversation, and I went back to the university and said, you know, that tenure, don't want it. Instead, I think I'm going to go to DC and see if I can become a part of this new solution. They were like, do you have an offer? I said, well, no. And so that was what I mean. You know, take a risk. I went to Washington. I ended up being Kevin's chief counsel for space commerce at a time when we were implementing the space traffic management policy and really getting involved in thinking about regulatory reform in a big and new way. And, you know, it was only a 2-year appointment, and, you know, that ended, and lo and behold, my current boss, also a mentor, Chirag Parikh, said, come on over here. So that's how I got here. It's just sort of a series of wonderful experiences, unforeseen, unplanned, and showing up. And if I would say, you know, you asked, were there burdens? There are always burdens. Life has its burdens, it has its upsides, and it has its downsides. But those burdens are also opportunities. They're opportunities to show up and to not, you cannot focus on the things that drag you down. You have to pull up your chair or your ladder or your whatever, and you just have to throw yourself into it.
Thanks. This may be like, you know, when you learn a new word, and then it seems like everyone is using that word. It seems to me that there are actually a pretty good number of women in the satellite regulatory affairs field. And maybe by that, I just mean 50-50, which is what it should be everywhere in the world, right? But do you get that same sense when you look around at the people who come into your offices and work for industry or work in government? And if you agree, have you ever thought about why that might be? What is it about either international or outer space or telecommunications that may have attracted women or pushed away other people? I'm not sure. I throw it open in case anyone has thought about this ever.
Maybe I'll jump in first. I mean, I think you're right that there are, at least in the United States, there are more women and have been. I mean, back in my time in NTIA, where I started 32 years ago, and when I started doing satellite issues, it was a lot of women, and there still are a lot of women on the regulatory policy side. But I think it's sort of an exception because it's not the same in the rest of the world. And of course, being here for CSW, and you look at the statistics, if we look at the space industry globally, it's small. I mean, I think it's 9% or 10%. There's not a lot of women on the engineering side, of course, and not a lot of women even on the policy regulatory side. So I think the US might be an exception. I'm not sure why, but I definitely found it very exciting. And I also never planned to, I didn't have a plan either. I didn't say that before, but I was not planning to be in telecommunications. I was going to be a doctor. Anyway, that's another story, but.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is when I was teaching in particular in the program that I started at Embry-Riddle, we had more women that were part of that program than any other program at the university, which was predominantly male. And I will say of the policy students I had, there were more women in the policy track, but not only. There were some wonderful male students that were graduates, and they've gone on to careers. That said, I do know that more and more of the people that reach out to me wanting career advice about being a space lawyer and how do you get from where I am to where you are, those kinds of questions. A lot of them are women. I always pay attention and talk to them. But I think one of the reasons that they're so attracted to space and as a subset communications is because of the aspirational and inspirational factor. And the fact that we're talking about communication, we're talking about networks, and that's something that women, we do that. Another reason is because we're detail oriented as a rule. And so I think there's it's sort of the right brain, left brain abilities working together. So I think women are particularly well suited to work in this field. Another thing I'm going to address, and then I'll hand it over to Jessica, is that this is a rapidly changing field and women are able to adapt to change. And so we're not thrown when you put a big wrinkle in the rug, we're going to step over it. We're going to find a way around it. We're going to iron it. We're going to do something, but we're not just going to go, oh my God, there's a great big wrinkle in the rug. So, and I think that's important too. Women we have the temperament to deal with rapidly changing situations. And we certainly do need that because we're pushing forward. Things are different. And in every level that we're representing up here on in front of all of you. And I think that's a very important part.
I love what Diane just said about looking to the skies, because I do think there's something in that, particularly in the United States. We have a tremendous history of leading in space. It is in our DNA to look up and try to make things happen. And I find that incredibly appealing as I try to reorient the Federal Communications Commission so we spend more time on these issues, because I think this is where we make history. This is where technology is going. And I also, when people ask for advice, you tell everyone, male and female alike, go for where there's growth. The space economy is probably $500 billion and getting bigger. The sheer volume of applications I have involving satellites before my agency is unprecedented. In the 6 decades we've been working on this, we've never seen anything like the volume we have. And I think all of that is exciting. And I think that growth bodes well for a more gender diverse future in this field.
And that's a great segue to the next set of questions that I want to ask. Certainly, if you have questions about sort of leadership and how they got where they were, do please write them down and we'll come back to them. But I'd like to turn now toward what your agencies are doing. So one of the most exciting things, in my opinion, to come out of the FCC, well, now you have two. So one was the establishment of the Space Bureau, which just made so much sense to me when I heard about it that I just wondered why it hadn't happened years ago. Of course, since I have been around for a few decades, I know why it was the International Bureau. I understand why that made sense when it was first started. And this is a constant struggle for, certainly for regulators, is keeping a pace with changes. So it made sense 30 years ago. It doesn't make sense today. Your agency has taken the lead and said we need to update that. And speak to us a little bit, whatever you can say. I know that it's not yet open for public comment, but what can you tell us about what drove those changes?
Well, sure. I appreciate your enthusiasm, by the way. I share it. When I took over the Federal Communications Commission, I do what anyone does when you come to a new job, a new opportunity. You survey what's going on. You engage in some pattern recognition. Where do we have a lot of volume? Where do we have too few people? Where do we have resources deployed that we might want to redeploy? And so over the course of the first few months, I started to notice that the volume of applications we had for satellites was off the charts. And the volume of applications we had for Earth gateway stations was like 8 times bigger than what we'd seen in history. And it felt to me that we needed to reorient the agency for that growth. Since we've announced the Space Bureau, we have 38% more people working on these applications. By the way, we still need more. This is a growth engine for the US economy. And I want our regulatory structure to respond in kind. There are going to be pressures on us to move fast and to think in ways that are different than what we've done in the past. We had an organization that was really set up for big satellites that were on the equator. We now are dealing with thousands and thousands in these new LEO systems, and we're going to need new policies and new practices. We're going to have to engage with the world, the ITU, differently on these issues. And it felt to me like it was an extraordinary opportunity for the US to lead, and reorganizing the agency was a way to get that started.
And so now let's turn in fact to those new types of satellites. As you said, of course, it's not just the Satellite Bureau, it's the Space Bureau, which leaves open the possibility for all the other things that are going into outer space, but that need spectrum to communicate back to Earth or possibly out to the moon. You can't send something up without controlling it, and that control is usually done via spectrum. So even the crewed stations, and that's CREWED, let's be clear, or mining facilities or whatever else in orbit servicing, they're all going to need some kind of authorization and spectrum. And it also creates this huge issue of traffic management, the sustainability of outer space, the potential for collisions, for more debris than we've already left there right now. And I know that Diane's old office, the Office of Space Commerce, is right in the middle of a second request for information about how to handle that kind of data and make sure that operators are apprised in time to do a maneuver, to avoid a collision. I mean, so far, so good in outer space. I would like to say, having worked for several operators, that the ones that are up there are very responsible, and they don't let competition as a service get in the way of safety. So, for example, OneWeb and Starlink, SpaceX's constellation, and Iridium and Globalstar, and all of the other operators speak almost daily, sometimes more than once a day, because they want to avoid any situation that could result in a collision, because no one wants to lose their income. But now that you've moved over to the White House Council, what is their role in sort of the space traffic management that the Office of Space Commerce is now going to be handling?
Well, our role is really like herding cats, if you must know. It's really a lot. I call it domestic diplomacy. It's more than anything. It's using soft skills to get communication lines open between the different departments and agencies that have equities and interests, and it's a challenge because, for instance, Department of Commerce is within the executive branch. The FCC is not, and yet they're both and the FAA is in the executive branch. Then we have other like NASA and Department of Defense and the intelligence community. They're not regulators, but they certainly have equities and they certainly have expertise. So how do you bring all of that together? So with regard to the space traffic management, sitting where I do, I've been helpful in helping the Department of Commerce and the Department of Defense implement Space Policy Directive 3. So it's not just good ideas on paper that make a policy directive. It's then getting resources so that you can implement. That's very important, which is, I think, kind of key to why you're doing a space bureau, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that the work that the Department of Commerce is now engaged in is something that's going to be very useful across the board. For instance, I know that in the FCC's orbital debris requirements, you ask for owner operators to perform some sort of collision avoidance, which now involves the 18th Space Force, but will ultimately be engaging with the Department of Commerce. So that's an element of supervision right there. So I don't think you're asking me about the in-space authorization and supervision right now. I think you're asking me about the space traffic management, but they're related, and they're related because how do we not just green light or give a permit or say yes, it's okay? How do we then in a meaningful way supervise without hindering? And I think that some of that interaction between owner operators such as OneWeb and Starlink and the others. And I think those are very good role models because they show how it can be done. I like to call it mutually assured benefit, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. And if you can show people how this benefits them and benefits their bottom line, they're much more prone to do it.
Thanks. And I love that mutually assured benefit, because I think when these companies speak to other agencies around the world or even other industry experts, sometimes they're surprised, for example, that competitors speak to each other and cooperate. But in fact, it is a mutually assured benefit. Doreen, if I may turn to you, the ITU is it's a treaty organization, and the members are nation states, and decisions are taken by everybody. And although you do not give licenses to be a constellation, your radio bureau has a lot of data. So when a nation announces to the ITU, we'd like to put up a constellation, we're going to use this altitude and these frequencies, more or less, it goes into a very large database at the ITU. And now that there is this concern about space situational awareness, I know that there has been a call, an increased concern about situational awareness. There's been a call for the ITU to at least participate in the discussion. You have data at least about projected locations. And any thoughts you can say about that?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe first, the ITU has been involved in space for 60 plus years, right? Because the ITU was the first to allocate spectrum to communication satellites back then. And as you will recall, because you were there also, Ruth, at the recent Plenipotentiary Conference where I was elected, space issues were debated to great extent. And I think I'm quite excited that we did get some good outcomes in regards to space, including ITU's role in the sort of Space Agenda 2030. There's lots of good language on space sustainability. And I think those are important areas where the ITU needs to focus. I have put space as a top priority issue. I was in Davos in January and everybody was talking about space. So I think we have a big role to play, and the UN Secretary General in his what's called Our Common Agenda has put space as well as one of the priority areas. And so they're going to be convening a space dialogue, which will take place next year as part of the Summit of the Futures. So that's also another critical area. And I think what has happened over recent years, months, with so many new satellite systems either announced or launching or already in space, is that there's a clear link with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, be it for monitoring, sensing, or for communications. I also think, and this comes back to ITU's main mandate, we have two strategic goals that were adopted. One is universal connectivity. The other is sustainable digital transformation, emphasis on the sustainable. And I think with the large number of LEO systems already up there, I think it gives us great hope. And I think it gives developing countries great hope when it comes to bridging the digital divide and the 2.7 billion that have never had access to the internet. So I think that's it's top priority for the ITU. Let's see how discussions evolve at the conference preparatory meeting, the CPM, that takes place very soon. And of course, we have the WRC in November, where we're all going to be spending our Thanksgiving in Dubai.
I was going to segue right into something in it, and I've forgotten entirely what it was. No. I'm going to have to move into my next question, and I have several, from the Zoom call already. But maybe it'll come back to me. I wanted to turn your attention to technology convergence, because this is an issue. I know when I teach my telecommunication law, we always spend a great deal of time talking about the problem for policymakers and regulators keeping up with technology. Technology moves very quickly, and often it's a good thing that the law does not move as quickly, but it is constantly an issue. And now we turn to the other incredibly new proposal from the FCC, and this is the single network future, which I hope you can talk a little bit about. And to me, it's this incredible awareness that the end user does not care how this works. We just want it to work, and we want it to work all the time and everywhere. And that may mean that the divisions that our world came up with 50 or 60 years ago, or 100 years ago, more than that, the ITU was, the International Telegraph Union, before wireless came about in the early 1900s, and they started, allotting. Oh, we'll put AM HAL. It's been a while, but those allocations are still there. So is it time? Is a single network future your attempt to bring us up to date?
What a wonderful introduction. So we can nerd out here, because I think what we're doing to try to envision a single network future is one of the most important activities at the Federal Communications Commission right now.
Absolutely.
I don't have to convert you.
No,
All right, that's good. Next week, I've asked my colleagues to vote on a big rulemaking, because it became apparent to us that we have long had policies for terrestrial spectrum. We put towers in the ground and we issue licenses, we frequently auction them off, make lots of money for the United States Treasury and other activities. And that regime has served us really well. But we also have this connectivity in our skies. And these two things really had very little to do with one another as a regulatory matter for a long time. But we're slowly realizing we can take both of those functionalities and put them in our devices. And just like you said, nobody cares how it all comes to pass. But this is going to take a whole lot of engineering and a whole lot of legal work to make it happen. But we're already seeing in the marketplace all of these new models to put base stations in our skies. What does that mean for terrestrial spectrum rights? What does it mean for interference for adjacent users? What kind of chipsets are necessary to make that viable? But if we do this right, we will get rid of dead zones in the United States and globally. We're going to create a level of connectivity that reaches that 2.7 billion who haven't seen it. And so it feels to me right now is a good time to talk about that single network future and start making proposals for it to happen. And we have a lot of experiments that are going on in the marketplace. I can't tell you which ones are going to succeed, which ones are going to fail, but I can tell you that rather than just address them on an ad hoc, one-by-one basis, I think in the United States, we should start to shape that environment so we can facilitate that innovation and make that connectivity possible everywhere.
So exciting. And I will be listening to the open meeting, even though I will also be at the Satellite 2023 conference at the same time. We have a lot of questions, and I'm going to start with a couple that we haven't touched on, although we talked about it a little bit in our pre-session, and that is about financing. And the question is, what is the role of each of your agencies or organizations in understanding the financial viability of an idea when you're making your policy decisions? What is the role, or maybe what should the role be? Anybody want to go first?
Well, I'm happy to jump in here because part of my trip to New York has been this investment community learning tour, and it's partly to answer those questions. One of the things that we really spent a lot of time thinking about, as well as talking about at National Space Council, is what is the appropriate role of government, and when you are drafting national strategies and national policies, shining light on anything does have, with great power comes great responsibility, and so even just putting, a little clause in something like the Space Priorities Framework that addresses or acknowledges active debris removal, brings it to a different level. And so there is an awareness. So we are spending some time to understand the investment community and understand the differences between VC, which is what we usually deal with, not so much for telecommunications, but for the new space or new entrants. But at the same time, we're also starting to redefine how we even, who do we include in the space economy? And so the Bureau of Economic Analysis at the Department of Commerce has spent some time and also gotten some funding to continue its work to better understand, just who's part of that economy. And then in understanding that, Jessica and I had a really good conversation earlier about what kind of metrics would help you determine the viability and the maturity of a business proposition. Because at the end of the day, those are the kinds of things that we can do with policy. We can, give demand signals in more ways than just, funding or updating an acquisition strategy, but also in giving demand signals in other ways, like setting standards or metrics to help make those determinations. Over.
Well, so from our standpoint, I think the focus is more on the policy and regulatory framework. What are the optimal frameworks that will incentivize investment? We have spent quite a lot of time on looking at innovative financing models for infrastructure rollout, which is particularly important for Africa. We did a study some years ago on connecting humanity, and we estimated it would cost some 400 plus billion to connect the unconnected. Those numbers were recently reconfirmed by the IMF. So that's a lot of funding. And that's for the infrastructure piece. And again, referring back to MWC, one of the big issues that kept coming up was device affordability. So if that device is going to connect to a satellite or connect to terrestrial means, how are we going to get devices to those that don't have devices, and how are those devices going to be affordable? So again, we're sort of taking it from the policy regulatory perspective.
Well, I just think for government, the challenge is how much clarity can we offer? Because the more clarity we offer, the easier it is for investment to follow. And yet the great challenge and wondrous thing about space is it's changing so fast and the innovations are so radical. So I feel like, we keep on running on a treadmill here to try to actually successfully create enough clarity to promote investment. But we're working on it. And I think in the end, these are good problems to have. It means you're working in a sector where innovation is the norm.
Thank you. Another one of the questions that came in was specifically about the sharing technology known as dynamic spectrum sharing. And I'm kind of assuming that that's addressed in the single network future, or?
Well, most of our work on dynamic spectrum sharing to date has taken place with terrestrial networks. But I think that's a useful tool for what we do in the future. Because remember, we've always had these ideas where like either spectrum was licensed or unlicensed, very binary, satellite or terrestrial, one or the other. And what we've done in recent years, particularly with the 3.5 gigahertz band, is we said, well, what if we broke down that binary structure? What if we said, you can use it while you use it, and if it's not being used, someone else can use it? In other words, we take from spectrum scarcity and we turn it into abundance with real-time information about use. That's what dynamic spectrum sharing systems are all about. We've now deployed them in the 3.5 gigahertz band, where we have a hierarchy of rights and we have environmental sensing systems that help support that. I really feel like that's a model for our spectrum future in many different ways. And I don't think that's just true domestically. I think it's actually true globally.
I don't know if either one of you have anything you want to say about that. I would just like to say that I often refer to the ITU's regime as one of the greatest self-regulating regimes in the world, because you have to share. And because if you don't share, if you're going to be a bully and you just start emanating your signal, your users also suffer interference, right? You can't just broadcast a signal and get away with it. So you have to share. You have to share, and it's fascinating to me. It is definitely one of the things that has attracted me to the field. So, if there is now a technology that can do it better, that's amazing. I've got nothing but good things to say about engineers, and I know they're going to figure this out. They are going to figure out a way, and it brings me to one of my concepts, which is that in this single network future, you may not need a mobile network operator on the ground. So right now, everybody gets service from a terrestrial mobile phone company. Maybe it's Verizon or Orange or Telefonica or TIM. But in the future, you could just get your signal directly from outer space. Because remember, this new generation of satellites, they're no farther away than the transatlantic fiber cable. Right? They're like 500-600 kilometers away. There's no delay. They have a great quality of signal. So I think that if the mobile network operators don't combine with satellite, they may suffer some losses, shall we say. And I wonder if you've thought about that. I mean, I hope the convergence goes well, but my awareness of convergence is that the incumbent fights like a cornered rat for a long time before giving in to what has become realized is inevitable. Any thoughts you can say publicly about this? Otherwise, we'll just move right into some other questions.
I think we're going to see a lot of cooperation. The realities for terrestrial networks is that it is economically viable to a certain portion of the landmass. There are places where it simply is not. There's every reason, technically and economically, for there to be that cooperation. And our single network future is really an effort to try to facilitate that and create a framework that can be replicated.
Spoken like a true diplomat.
Can I just make some publicity? So join us for the GSR, which will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh in June, because lots of these issues will be discussed where we bring together the world's regulators together with our industry members.
Thank you for that promo, which I will second, because having worked with regulators around the world, in fact, I've probably spent more time with non-US regulators than with the FCC myself.
You can visit, you can come by.
But I haven't had to. I'm talking mostly with less mature regulators in nations that are just facing the issues of how do I connect my people? And they don't talk to each other. So I might speak to 8 or 9 different countries every day, but they don't speak to each other except at the ITU's Global Symposium for Regulators. It is an amazing opportunity for them to recognize that the islands of the Caribbean and the islands of the South Pacific and the landlocked nations in the middle of Africa are struggling with the same issues. And they may already have been studied or addressed in another region, and they can learn from each other. So it's an amazing opportunity. I want to close, I think I'm closing, with a question from online from the father of 3, soon to be 4. And he himself is a lawyer, entrepreneur in the space industry, but has young daughters who are thirsty for life. And he wonders if you have advice to this very young generation coming up. It seems like a lovely way to close.
Well, I'm going to jump in there. So I'm going to say what I said in my first statement, and that is show up all the way, and pay attention to the world that you live in and listen to your moral compass. And when you're challenged, rise to the challenge. Don't see it as a burden, see it as an opportunity. And reach out, ask for help when you need it.
And I would just like to say, it doesn't have to be lawyers and it doesn't have to be engineers. the space industry is going to explode in a good way, if it hasn't already. So many companies are going to depend on outer space. And so all the traditional roles in any kind of company will now be in a space industry. And so that shouldn't be hard to do. Doreen or Jessica?
Well, I'm a mother of 4, and I was determined to have my 4 end up in a STEM field. So I sent them to coding camps and coding weekends, and I still pay the price for that, but it did help them. I think my advice, I mean, picking up on your points, which I fully agree with, I think just shoot for the stars, be determined, be yourself, and don't give up, even when many around you will try to bring you down.
Well, it's variation on a theme here, but show up, speak up, pull up a chair, and when people try to suggest you shouldn't be sitting at the table, you don't let that get you down. You just keep on showing up. I think an underappreciated skill is tenacity, and I recommend it to just about everyone. I know in my own professional life, I wouldn't be here without it.
Doreen may remember the theme, the commercial for the state of Virginia's lottery, forgive me, used to be, you got to play to win. You got to show up. You got to show up. If you don't show up, you're not going to get the job. You're not going to hear the information, what have you. We have literally time for one more question. I'm going to squeeze it in from someone online, I believe, about the space sustainability rating. So this is a voluntary rating that the World Economic Forum thought up. It's involved MIT, and a university in Switzerland is now spearheading it, where a space-going venture would voluntarily subject itself to this rating and get, like being a green building, right, or a LEED building, you would get a rating that I think the hope would be that it would get you better insurance rates, or possibly better financing, or customers who care about your environmental sustainability in outer space. Any thoughts from the panelists on this rating, or these kinds of ratings, or maybe there's a better way to do it?
Well, Ruth, that goes right to the kind of metrics that I was talking about earlier, and I'm very familiar with the SSR, which is the acronym for that, Space Sustainability Ratings. And full disclosure, before I came to government, I was involved in the early days of that through UT Austin. So I really haven't been part of it since, but I do know that there are a lot of good uses, a lot of good ways that you can incentivize good behavior through the use of something like that. And I think that is the kind of thinking, if not that particular model, that kind of thinking is what we need.
Well, with that, I think I'd like to ask Catherine to come back up to the front. And we have a final gift for you, just as it's going away.
So, Tamara, I believe you have the final gift. I don't have. Okay. But I will just take a moment to say thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much to everybody for coming, for supporting this event, for everybody that joined us online from around the world. It's an absolute privilege. I mean, inspiring is the smallest thing I could say, to hear from each of you the topics you're wrestling with. And as you said, there's so much exciting and explosive growth, and in a good way, happening in our industry. And it's really great to see ladies leading the way on that. So thank you for coming. And then I have our SSPI-WISE scarf. So if you're ever at a conference full of thousands of people, you see the SSPI-WISE scarf, you know you have an ally there in the crowd, even when it feels like there's no one else that looks like you at the table. So we have this here. I'll bring it over. Thanks so much, everyone.